articles and several influential books, such as The Servant of Globalization, Migration and Domestic Work, Illicit Flirtations, Labor, Migration, and Sex Trafficking in Tokyo, and Children of Global Migration, Transnational Families and Gender Woes. Her most recent project is Unfree, Migrant Domestic Work in Arab States, which has recently received the 2023 American Sociological Association Scholarly Book Award. Unfree interrogates the concepts of freedom and unfreedom to offer an alternative interpretation to the relationship between employers and their domestic workers, beyond exploitation and oppression. The book considers the experiences of migrant domestic workers in the UAE and how different stakeholders such as the state, intermediary agencies, and domestic workers' employers understand and use the workers' unfree position to maintain their own interests. Lifting women's voices from the margins, this ethnographic research applies social and economic lenses that highlight migrant domestic workers as autonomous individuals with aspirations that they exercise their agency. Her talk today is entitled The Unfree Market of Care Work. I welcome to the stage Dr. Rosel Parejas.
Great. Working. Go back to it. Yeah. Okay. So let me start by really expressing my gratitude for this invitation to speak to this audience. There are many people here whose work I admire tremendously and who I've never met. And I'm excited to meet many of you in the next 2 days. I'm looking for the timer here because I hate going over. And I was given 35 minutes, and I'm sure you'll be like grateful for me not to go over too. Thank you to the organizing committee. There's so many people that I could thank, but so because of time, I not name everyone. But it's really been a pleasure visiting Costa Rica so far. It's been really lovely. So let me start. It's kind of awkward here because I have notes. So the talk that I'm going to give today, this evening, draws from my most recent study, which looks at the intersections of human trafficking and the labor migration of domestic workers. And I focus specifically on the question of the governance of domestic workers. So across the globe, we've seen the heightening demand for paid domestic work. According to the International Labor Organization, or the ILO, there are now more than 65 million paid domestic workers globally. But the marketization of domestic work and the demand for this labor has not necessarily increased the negotiating power of domestic workers. It also has not necessarily led to better working conditions. So in fact, domestic workers remain some of the most vulnerable group of workers to human trafficking. And this is according to the ILO. And this means they are vulnerable to exploitation, including sexual exploitation and or their subjection to servitude, slave-like practices, or forced labor. And then those who are most vulnerable to human trafficking, they say, are migrant workers. And so this reality cannot just be explained by the logic of supply and demand. We can attribute much of it to the governance of domestic work. Hence, this is what I want to focus on today, this evening. So I wish to foreground the state in our analysis of the market of paid domestic labor. So the state is important because in almost all countries that legally receive them, migrant domestic workers are what we could call tied workers or bound laborers. Because their legal status is contingent on not only their live-in employment, but but also their sole and continuous employment in one household, as well as their limited access to the labor market. So these conditions, because they deny domestic workers, quote unquote, freedom of association, technically render them unfree. So to be unfree is a status that is not an exception to any country, but it is one that migrant domestic workers in almost all destinations share, including, for example, Denmark, Israel, Lebanon, Gulf Cooperation Council countries such as Oman and Kuwait, and various destinations in Asia, such as Singapore, Malaysia, and Taiwan. And this likewise historically applied to the case of Canada through its live-in caregivers program. And finally, it applies to the 20,000 estimated au pairs currently working in the United States. So if we are to situate our discussion in a transnational feminist framework, we should recognize that bound labor is arguably imposed on migrant domestic workers by what Karen Kaplan and Inderpal Gruel would call the scattered hegemony of the ideology of female domesticity. And it's a form of legal infantilization that maintains the view of domestic workers as household dependents. So it renders them unfree as it ties them to an employer sponsor who in varying degrees can prevent them from leaving their job. So the inability of domestic workers to change jobs underscores their unfree status. So for example, in Gulf Cooperation Council countries such as the United Arab Emirates or the UAE, migrant domestic workers have to secure the permission of their employer to quit their job or exit the country. So this is likewise the case in Singapore. So in Hong Kong, they do not need to secure the permission of their employer to leave, but the government limits them to a 2-week window to find a new employer before they risk deportation. And then in Taiwan, as a final example, they can only change employers if the state deems their employer no longer fit to employ them, which would happen if the employer passed away, declared bankruptcy, or left the territory. So the legal incorporation of migrant domestic workers as bound laborers agrees with the view of domestic workers as one of the family, which is described by feminist sociologists, including Mary Romero and Judith Rollins, as a controlling mechanism that is used by employers to solicit uncompensated labor. So agreeing with the constitution of domestic workers as one of the family, most countries do not offer labor protection, and if they do, enforcement is made difficult by the live-in requirement of their employment. And so to give a few examples, in Singapore, domestic workers are not covered by the Employment Act. In Taiwan, they're not covered by the Labor Standards Law, and in Israel, a 2009 Supreme Court ruling excluded them from the work and rest hour law. And so there are a few countries that include domestic workers in their labor laws, in their general labor laws, and that would include Canada, Jordan, and Italy, to name a few. But as Abigail Bacan and Divesta Sulis have observed in Canada, the enforcement of these laws are not a priority, resulting at the end in the absence of protection for domestic workers. So as I just explained, migrant domestic workers are considered vulnerable to human trafficking, and so according to the ILO, there's about 11.5 million of them. Most are women. The largest constituency can be found in Arab states. Most of them are from the global south, and they come from various, so they come from various regions of the global south, but the largest constituency of them are from Southeast Asia, with an estimated 2.1 million from Indonesia and 1.4 million from the Philippines. So it's not just me, but also other scholars who are paying attention to the bound labor of domestic workers. So summarizing the literature, they generally argue that bound labor leads to various forms of subjugation, including alienation, enslavement, and trafficking. So what's important to point out is there are certain assumptions of freedom that underlie their analysis. So in the literature, discussions generally abide by Marxist or liberal notions of freedom. So studies either follow Marxist view of unfree labor as being the alienation of the worker from their labor within particular socio-economic systems of exploitation, or they're influenced by liberal theorists such as Isaiah Berlin and their discussion of negative liberty, meaning the ability to act without hindrance or constraint. And so while Marx views feudalism and slavery as the ultimate socioeconomic systems of exploitation that result in labor alienation, that is, unfreedom, he argues that wage workers are likewise unfree in capitalism because they remain separated from their means of production and thus compelled to sell their labor. And so following this logic, scholars establish the unfree status of migrant domestic workers by describing the ways they are embedded in socioeconomic systems of exploitation that then result in alienation. And so to give one example, geographers Kendra Strauss and Judy Fudge, looking at the use of labor agencies in Canada, basically say like the increased formalization of domestic work through these agencies leads to the double alienation of domestic workers and their further removal from their means of production. But there's actually more scholars that abide with a liberal framework for thinking about the freedom or lack of freedom of domestic workers, and that is they correlate freedom to the state of being without restraint. So we see this in their uniform assertion that interference, that is the inability of domestic workers to enter the labor market without hindrance, results in some type of exploitation. And so in other words, their central concern is the denial of negative liberty for domestic workers. So in this perspective, scholars underscore how the domestic worker is not this independent person who can do whatever they want, with the biggest affront for them being their inability to quit their job. And so this state of being trapped, they say then, is a form of structural violence that leads to a master-slave relationship in the context of England, contract slavery in Lebanon, or labor trafficking in the UAE. So in other words, scholars who abide by a liberal notion of freedom see the denial of negative liberty as tantamount to exploitation. But this is what's interesting. This is what's interesting, sort of scholars recognize and admit that the people that they're studying, the domestic workers they're analyzing and reducing to being trafficked or enslaved, are not all abused by their employers. And so this non-uniform reality or the lack of universality in their experiences is something that scholars have basically just swept under the rug. And so this is a contradiction that they have not been able to resolve, leading them to dismiss the presence of good employers in the context of bound labor as nothing more than an anomaly. But I want to ask this question, is it really just an anomaly that we find good employers, or does their existence point to the limits in the utility of a liberal notion of freedom? So I'm able to answer these questions because of the fieldwork that I did in one of the, quote, worst destinations where migrant domestic workers end up, and that is the United Arab Emirates and Singapore. So even though I studied, I did research in both countries for my book and in this talk, I'm just gonna talk about my data in the United Arab Emirates, and I do so for many reasons. I'll just say one being is like the harder, the greater challenge of accessing that region, and second, our relative lack of knowledge of the situation of domestic workers in that region. But we could say that the domestic workers in the United Arab Emirates face some of the worst conditions of domestic workers in that country. The average starting salary for domestic workers from the Philippines is $215 a month. So even though I don't have a lot of time to talk about my data or my methods, one thing I want to say is that I did not conduct convenience sampling. Instead, I tried to, if I did that, I would have gathered, actually convenience sampling would have resulted in me giving you the worst case scenario of the situation of domestic workers in the United Arab Emirates, because the most easy to find are those who are in migrant shelters for abused workers. So I just want to say that my sample is diverse as it includes those with a day off and those without a day off. It includes documented workers and undocumented workers, and it also includes, it actually represents domestic workers who work in a diverse range of households that include Emirati employers, American and other Western employers, South Asian employers, and other Arabs. So, okay, so who were the people that I primarily interviewed in the United Arab Emirates? So the domestic workers that I met there were mostly, surprisingly, and this is something that sort of defies common assumptions or assertions in migration studies, which says that most migrants are without resources. The people who actually end up in the United Arab Emirates tend to be the poorest in the Philippines. They come from regions without a wage economy. They lived in houses without, that looked like this, without running water or electricity. They come from extremely rural areas. And they tend to, if you ask them why they migrated, they'll say it's so that I can have money to buy rice. Many were single mothers, with those coming from the autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao, bearing their first child by the age of 14 years old. And so the question is, why does this group of people end up in the United Arab Emirates? Why do they seek domestic work in the United Arab Emirates? And so I want to say that for many of them, the unfreedom of servitude gives them more hope than the unfreedom of poverty that they would face in the Philippines. So my dissatisfaction with dominant discourse, I'm going to return to my discussion of freedom. So my dissatisfaction with dominant discourse on the unfree labor of domestic workers is because of their inapplicability to the situation in the UAE. So despite their unfree status, migrant domestic workers in the United Arab Emirates experience a diversity of work conditions. So some have a day off, some don't have a day off. Some are paid, most are paid at the end of the month, but some find themselves employed in households that refuse to pay them until the end of their 2-year contract. Most have private bedrooms, but some find themselves having to sleep on the kitchen floor. Some have access to a mobile phone, while some are completely denied access to communicating even with their children in the Philippines. Some are overworked and they work 18 hours a day, but some find that their employers expect them to work for no more than 8 hours a day. A few of the people I interviewed faced extreme brutality, with some raped, some others tortured. But the vast number of people who ran away didn't do so because of this extreme brutality. They often did so because they were overworked. So the reduction of these various experiences to slavery or human trafficking clearly disregards this diversity. So I'd like to argue that the inability of dominant discourse to explain variations in labor conditions ultimately points to the limits of a liberal or Marxist framework of analysis. A Marxist or liberal-based analysis cannot, for example, account for how other laws, particularly those that seek to protect the human rights of domestic workers, would mediate their bound status. And then finally, a liberal formulation of unfreedom is limited by its blind advocacy for the absence of any restraint on migrant domestic workers as a solution. So we see this in the romanticization of illegality as a solution to bound labor, which is an argument that Pardis Mahdavi advanced in the UAE and Pei Chialan in Taiwan. But these calls for autonomy do not necessarily decrease the power of the unregulated employer, as they imply that any form of governance, including loss of protection, would entail interference or a threat to autonomy. So how do we account for this diversity of labor conditions then of domestic workers? So before I answer that question, let me just systematically describe to you what is the culture of domestic work in the United Arab Emirates. So there's many variables that we can use to measure the labor conditions of domestic work, which I list on this slide above. But to have consistency in my analysis, I'm only gonna use one, and that is I'm gonna compare the food consumption of domestic workers across households. And I decided to focus on food consumption because it was often what domestic workers used to value their labor, as we can see with this correspondence I had with a domestic worker who told me, thank God that my employer is so very kind to me and all food are give to me. So I'm not the first to look at food to measure domestic work. My colleagues, Paige Yalan, Pierrette Handanu-Sotelo, and Mary Romero have done so, but unlike them, I don't really look at food merely as a tool of oppression, but instead I look at it as a more neutral category. So this is what I found. So across households in the United Arab Emirates, domestic workers face work conditions that can be described as one of dehumanization, infantilization, or recognition. And so this would apply to all conditions, whether it's the provision of the day off, or as I'm going to talk about now, food. So let me just get into it. So in some households, domestic workers are dehumanized. So what does it mean to be dehumanized? To be dehumanized basically means that you are not adequately fed. So in some households, they actually do not feed domestic workers more than once a day. In one case, I have one interviewee, her name is Marikar. She told her Emirati employer that if you don't feed me more than once a day, I will likely die. And the employer reacted and said, dogs only eat once a day, so why can't you? So clearly she was dehumanized. So in this other example, Annalisa was complaining to her employer that she has to eat more than rice to survive. And the employer basically told her that in the Philippines, people don't eat anything but rice. And so you can see this clear dehumanization of domestic workers. So in other households, they feed their domestic workers 3 meals a day at the very least, but they infantilize them. And so they infantilize them by not recognizing that they have their own tastes and preference for food. In some cases, domestic workers don't have a problem with that, as we see with the case of Joza, who basically is fed mostly Lebanese food, and she says that this is digestible to her, so it's fine. But in some cases, infantilization borders dehumanization, and so in another case, I have an interviewee, her name is Josie. Josie worked for a personal trainer who was very concerned about the high sugar intake of Josie. And so for this reason, she barred Josie from consuming rice, which is probably the worst offense you can do to a Filipino. And so instead, she basically gave her, so Josie could eat anything she wants, but Josie complained to me. She was like, well, the only thing available for me to eat there is quinoa and power bars. And then finally, you have actually recognized domestic workers. And so in these households, domestic workers can eat whatever they want to eat. They either have one, free reign in for the refrigerator. Second, they're given a food allowance, which is actually not that much. It's usually $75 a month. And third is that they ask domestic workers what they want to purchase when the family does their weekly shopping. And so in the case of Dora, we see that her employer always makes sure that she includes rice in their weekly grocery list. So I want to say, though, that recognition is not a signal of equality. Recognition is just basic recognition of a domestic worker's humanity, because recognition does not eliminate the status hierarchy that shapes the relations between employers and domestic workers. And in the case of the UAE, their domestic workers know that there are certain things, for example, in the refrigerator that they can't touch, like the manchego cheese or the blueberries, because they're expensive. So let me now, then, help us try to make sense of this diversity. How do we understand the diversity of labor conditions for domestic workers who find themselves in the status of being unfree? So how do we account for their severe structural constraints, their severe vulnerability to abuse, without erasing the diversity of the labor conditions that arise from their vulnerable and precarious situation? And so doing so requires that we actually shift from a liberal towards a Republican, small r, framework for understanding freedom. So liberalism generally sees freedom as the valuation of individuals over society. Republicanism, in contrast, values community over the individual. As the political theorist Philip Pettit explains, unfreedom, is not the denial of autonomy, but instead it is susceptibility to domination. So freedom, in turn, is the minimization of this susceptibility. So according to Pettit, and I quote him, what constitutes the power relationship is the fact that in some respect the power bearer could interfere arbitrarily even if they are never going to do so. So to put it another way, domestic workers are unfree not because their employers control their ability to quit their job, but because employers can interfere upon it. So this formulation of unfreedom allows us to see it as a relational process, and in so doing recognize that the arbitrary power of employers could lead to a variety of outcomes. And so I think this is one of the biggest problems that we have when we think about the bound labor of domestic workers. We look at domestic work as a structure and not as a relationship that can be negotiated by people. So we need to acknowledge that being able to interfere does not mean one will necessarily do so. So as we saw in the case of food, some employers chose to deny domestic workers access to sufficient food, while some gave them more than they could possibly consume. But I want to caution that our end goal is not for domestic workers to have the ability to eat whatever they want to eat, because in this scenario, the arbitrary authority of employers hold. And that this arbitrary authority tells us that domestic workers remain susceptible to extreme abuse. And so we should be cautious about this because my interviews with employers tell me that recognizing the humanity of domestic workers is not something that employers do so altruistically necessarily, right? And so we see this in this quote from a British employer. I interviewed Caroline, and I'll read what she said. She says, now they just expect to have free reign on your fridge, and when they're doing the shopping as well, like mine, you find that they are buying things that they don't need, or they will buy shrimps or something to make their shrimp noodles. And I would never buy shrimps. And then they're buying themselves cans of Coca-Cola and things. And I'm saying, look, I didn't say I was going to keep you in bloody tin soft drinks. I'm not going to pay for that. You want Coca-Cola, buy it out of your wages. A lot of them are asking for toiletries as well. And I'm saying, piss off, I owe you. I pay you enough money to buy your own antiperspirant. They are pushing the envelope the whole time. They're asking for more and more. So Caroline's complaints are telling. It tells us that her recognition of her domestic workers' desire to eat shrimps is not enabled by altruism, like I said, but instead by this unspoken moral pressure that she begrudgingly succumbs to. This then raises the question of what are the sources of her moral pressure. So the complaints of Caroline are significant as they indicate the need to have mechanisms in place that would discourage employers like her from acting on their arbitrary power over domestic workers. The need for such mechanisms tells us that we have to think beyond a liberal formulation of freedom, which calls for the right of individuals for autonomy. Instead of seeking autonomy, Republican political theorist Pettit argues that freedom can be best achieved through the alleviation and reduction of the arbitrary domination of those in power. This can be achieved through mechanisms of what he calls anti-power. So according to Pettit, anti-power, the diffusion of the authority of those with power is best enforced via these formal mechanisms of laws, welfare state initiatives, empowerment projects. But in the case of migrant domestic workers in the UAE, these formal mechanisms already exist. But as Abigail Bakken and Diva Stoulis told us a long time ago, the enforcement of these formal mechanisms would be very challenging in the private space of domestic workers. So this tells us then that we have to look beyond formal mechanisms of anti-power, but also to look at how it informally manifests. And so this also tells us that the solutions that we have to have has to exceed the law and the formal mechanisms of anti-power promoted by Pettit. And so this also tells us that gender distinguishes solutions to unfreedom as migrant women who are concentrated in informal private workplaces and migrant men who are concentrated in formal public workplaces require distinct mechanisms of anti-power. And so based on this gender difference in my book, I expand on Pettit and their push for regulation to delimit the ability of people with power to impose arbitrary domination on the unfree. And so I argue, that's kind of the central argument of my book, that it's also morals and not only laws that mitigate the arbitrary power of, the arbitrary authority of employers. So I have 7 minutes. So I want to talk about something that I'm thinking a lot about that's not in my book, which is how have governments, receiving governments, manage the unfree labor or the bound labor that they impose on domestic workers. And so I want to take us to Canada and Singapore because they follow two very different solutions to easing the vulnerabilities of bound labor. And so whether we follow a liberal or Republican formulation of freedom and unfreedom, it's very difficult to not acknowledge the susceptibility of domestic workers who are bound to their employers, right? So this abuse could be, the denial of food, like I just talked about, or isolation or overwork. So how have governments that acknowledge their demand for the paid labor of domestic workers accordingly address the susceptibility of domestic workers to abuse from the policies that impose the condition of bound labor? So as we see in the case of Canada and Singapore, two established destinations for migrant domestic workers, that first, governments do not ignore the susceptibility of domestic workers to abuse, and second, certain assumptions of freedom guide their implementation of policies to address their susceptibility. So what comes of these solutions? So in Canada, the government's recent attempts to reform its governance of domestic workers towards the reduction of their vulnerability has resulted in the near abolishment of the live-in caregivers program. So the actions of the Canadian government, we can say, follow a liberal doctrine of freedom as its solutions have been geared towards the increase in the autonomy of domestic workers, but not at the expense of the autonomy of employers. So what comes of this? Conflicts arise that indicate to us the untenability of liberal freedom. We see this first in the heightened regulation of domestic work in Canada and the inclusion of domestic work in general labor laws. Yet these laws cannot be enforced as doing so would encroach on the privacy, in other words, autonomy of employers. So the formal regulation of domestic work as a solution cannot work in a liberal society. And so second, we see the limits of liberalism in the conundrum the Canadian government has faced when it comes to the housing arrangement of the domestic worker. So to increase the autonomy of domestic workers, the government has granted them the option to live out of their employers' homes. But this has come at the cost of the elimination of their eligibility for permanent residency. So in the past, like if you complete 2 years of continuous live-in work, you could qualify for permanent residency. But this system was criticized by activists as a form of modern-day slavery. So as a result of this critique, the association of freedom with autonomy has led to basically the termination of the live-in caregivers program, which is sort of coveted by domestic workers, especially from the Philippines. So going to Singapore, a city-state where there are more than 200,000 domestic workers, the government embraces a Republican understanding of freedom, as government policies have been focused on countering the arbitrary authority of employers. So eliminating the authority they know is impossible, especially it takes place in the unregulated space of the workplace. But the government has implemented, nonetheless, mechanisms of anti-power that they hope will create standards which accordingly can guide the actions of employers. So one of the things they do is they mandate for them to take a class to be able to employ a domestic worker. Second is that if they change their domestic worker one too many times within a given year, they face the risk of being forced to take the class again. And second, if there's enough complaints about them filed by the domestic worker, they face the risk of being temporarily or permanently disqualified from being able to hire a domestic worker. But the problem in Singapore, however, is that the value of domestic workers as an individual remains low. So we see this low value in the failure of many employers to see domestic workers as autonomous subjects. So, we can manage domestic workers pretty much in two ways. Either we assign them, we see domestic work as task-oriented, or we see domestic work as time-oriented. So task-oriented would be us seeing domestic workers as these autonomous subjects. We give them a certain set of jobs, of work, and when they're done, they can do whatever they want. But in Singapore, domestic workers are not really seen as liberal persons. So most employers there actually see domestic workers as those whose time they can control. So in Singapore, it's very common for employers to micromanage domestic workers, to expect them to work 18 hours a day, to limit them to a 30-minute break every 8 hours, and to deny them access to a telephone during the time that they're supposedly working. So for example, limiting their access to the phone between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. And so you see in Singapore how the household as a microcosm of society trumps the individual. So this points to us the limits of a Republican framework for understanding freedom as well. So in conclusion, I'd like to underscore the continued vulnerability to abuse of domestic workers, and this is despite first the market demand for their labor, and second, efforts to standardize their labor. But how we understand the vulnerability of domestic workers has to look beyond the nuances in their situation, beyond various variations in practices, but what I'm trying to show is that we also have to consider the philosophies of freedom that undergird the behavior and actions of both employers and advocates. So let me end there. Should we go? 34 minutes.
Okay, first, thank you so much for this talk. It was incredible. And we're going to have some questions coming from the audience now. Did you get to work?
No, I have a hard time with this. Okay. Turn this on. Oh, I got it. No, I got it.
You get some? Should I come to you to get my file? Okay. Okay, those don't have names, so I'm not going to name the person that asked the question, but the first question we have is, can you talk more about activism work, resources and investments available to domestic workers in the places you have studied?
So thank you for your question. So what's very interesting, right? So this is like a problem where the largest group of migrant domestic workers, the formal migrant domestic workers with a visa, are in Arab states. Yet in many of these countries, there is no civil society, and that it's illegal to do any kind of advocacy work for domestic workers. And so the people who provide support to them are usually just like service like from the government. And it's usually through migrant shelters. But more recently, I can't remember the year exactly, but it wasn't very long ago, so another site I've looked at, Singapore, interestingly, started allowing advocacy groups like Transit Workers Too and HOME, I can't remember what it's an acronym for, to do support services for domestic workers. But they're very limited in what they can do. Also, so they do a lot more of just like, it's not so much like, you know, they're not even, I mean, first they try to do, Transit Workers too tries to do studies, and then they try to release these studies, sort of like Human Rights Watch strategy of trying to create like these like aspirational moral standards in hopes that it would set like a higher bar for how people should treat migrant workers in general. But they tend to focus not so much on domestic work, but on construction workers primarily, but so just a little bit on domestic workers. Home, on the other hand, they do a lot of more like, let's rescue people, like kind of a very anti-trafficking, a typical anti-trafficking strategy. So in terms of just like trying to empower domestic workers the way they do in the National Domestic Worker Alliance in the US, that doesn't really exist in these other sites I've looked at. But the first site that I ever studied, which was Italy, labor unions had always had such a stronghold for the situation of migrant workers, and I think that's why Italy has the best and most progressive labor conditions for migrant domestic workers.
¿No? ¿Ahí? Ahí, sí, perdón. Bueno, voy a leer las preguntas en español. Una de las preguntas es si usted cree que el concepto de unfreedom, como lo está planteando, puede servir para pensar en otras relaciones laborales, sobre todo del trabajo precario. Y relacionado con esto, ¿qué ruta tomar para reflexionar la moral en los empleadores?
Can they repeat it in English without, can they just repeat it? Yeah. Oh, could you repeat it? Yeah.
The translator.
Hold on. The problem is I can't hear them because, so then you're reading it, they're speaking, and I can't hear it because the microphone's so loud.
Well, I will try to translate it in my broken English. So, do you believe, what do you think about the, translate the unfreedom concept to another kind of work relations?
Yeah.
Beside the domestic work?
Yeah. So, so the concept of unfreedom, right, is really trying to, it's really, so, okay, why am I looking at unfreedom? So I'm looking at unfreedom because one, of the connection between labor trafficking and migrant labor, which we don't do enough in mainstream migration studies. Yet, most migrant workers in the world are vulnerable to extreme exploitation because they're also bound laborers. So it's not just domestic workers who are in this situation. We could actually say the South Asian workers in Twitter. You remember when like Elon Musk took over and then it was like, he's like, look, these people are like not all quitting. Look at all these people next to me working till midnight because, you know, they love my company and they're all like Indian, you know? And so, well, these are the people who basically, if they quit their job, they will be deported back to their country of origin. And to get one of those, this is Pallavi's work, like if you get one of those H-1B visas, it's like by lottery, so it's like very coveted and hard to get. So you see this situation of being unfree, meaning being highly vulnerable to be abused by someone else, as actually a rampant condition that we could apply not just to migrant workers, but to many of us, you know, in unequal relations of power.
And I think I have a follow-up question like relating to that. It says, how do you account for the impact of the different state contexts on domestic workers' experiences of freedom? And then they say, for example, does freedom vary by place?
Across place.
By place or across.
Yeah, so I want to answer this question. So what's really interesting, whenever I give a lecture, and I always, you know, so you saw the slide where it's like, look, domestic workers are stuck to their employers in all these countries, including Denmark. We can include Netherlands into that, you know, many other countries in Europe. Europeans can't take it. Like, they freak out. They freak out. And they're like, you cannot link us to Arab states, like we are humane people, right? So then I always respond, I say, well, like domestic workers or au pairs, the Philippine government barred au pairs from going to Europe until 2010 because of the high cases of abuse. There is a reason why domestic workers in Scandinavian countries are primarily from the Philippines. And I really doubt it's because they want to have a cultural exchange in which their kids learn Tagalog, right? And so because of the high levels of abuse there, it was banned. But I will say, however, that discourses of human rights across countries do make a difference. So that's why it's like these informal ways. I mean, so we can think about like what are kind of general moral standards that we have across society. Then I also do think that in places like the United Arab Emirates, it is more likely that people will get killed. Domestic workers will get killed. It's more likely that they will be abused. And one of the reasons I think is very spatial, you know, like a lot of these places are very like, domestic workers are like isolated. They work in these large villas. People are doing things that no one else can see, right? So, but if we actually have come to realize that, you know, it's this argument, like if your friends can see you do something, you won't do it. No, that's not true. Like a lot of people are so immune and, you know, oblivious to their subjugation of domestic workers. But I do think that there is like moral standards or human rights standards across countries.
Bueno, ahora realizaré la próxima pregunta. Nos preguntan si podría hablar sobre la estrategia metodológica, cómo ganó la confianza de las trabajadoras domésticas y de los empleadores. ¿Podés escucharla?
Okay, yes, yeah. So methodology, thank you for asking me a methodology question. I was dreading doing the study because everyone was saying that this is very hard to access, but then I ended up enjoying the study. And I think I enjoyed the study because I was surrounded by, I couldn't do the study in isolation. I had to partner with many people. So one of my first strategies for doing the study was I went to the United Arab Emirates and Singapore as an educator, as a teacher, and not as a, quote, researcher or journalist. So if you came alone as a researcher or journalist and you tried to go to an employment agency, they'd be like, what are you, you know, you're from Human Rights Watch, you're gonna do this expose on us. Same thing with employers. But because I went there as a teacher with 10 undergraduates, they were like opening their doors to me. They were doing these like, let us give you our business plan. This is how we racialize people from Malawi. This is how we racialize people from the Philippines. And they were so proud of it because then I did have business students. I said, when the students introduced themselves, they were like, I'm a business major, you know. So that was one strategy that made employers and other actors, like embassies, government officials, like agencies, they were like kind of hard to access, but they were totally opened their doors when I was Professor Pereñas and not like journalist Pereñas, you know. And then a second thing was like being Filipino helps a lot. Speaking the language helps a lot with getting the trust of domestic workers. The hardest to access were undocumented workers because in the United Arab Emirates, being undocumented is a criminal. It's not in the U.S., but in the UAE, it's criminal to be undocumented, and you're charged. It's like $8 a day and then you get incarcerated if you're caught. So people want to get caught in Ramadan because that's when they get forgiven their debt. So a lot of the Filipinos, it was not hard for me, but then look at me because I'm Filipino. A lot of the employers would not trust me. They would think I'm like spying on them, or they think I'm like, you know, not really like, you know, I'm not supportive of, you know, what they do. So I hired graduate students who looked like them to do the interviews with employers. And it was fantastic because then they would just tell me like I'll give you an example. In Singapore, they're like, we prefer to hire Indonesians because Indonesians are so stupid, you know? Like, you can tell them, like, the sky is green, and they'll say, yes, the sky is green. You know, like, they would never tell me that, you know? But they would tell their, like, you know, Chinese Singaporean, this PhD student from University of Chicago. They would tell her that because she's Chinese Singaporean, but they would never tell me that. But that's how I accessed different groups for this study.
And did you have any, I'll just add this, about what you can or cannot publish, because it's such a controversial, like restrictions on what you can say or not, or about the government or the state and agencies?
No, like, well, I thought I wasn't going to be let into the United Arab Emirates after the book came out because there's so many. Like this woman, Lavi Kathiravelu, she wrote a book on the friendship of South Asian construction workers. She tried to go in and they didn't let her in. Syed Ali, he was in his last day of field work. He got arrested, detained for 12 hours, and then they took his computer and wiped it clean. So there's so many more, right? Like that happened to. I've been going back, and they don't really they've sort of left me alone. One time I was summoned by a high-ranking government official, and he wanted to know what my findings were, and then I shared it to him, which I shared to you, and he was like, great, we know some of us abuse them, but we know not all of them abuse them, so great. And so but then he did say most other scholars, they have this political agenda, he said, and then they just give this one narrative of complete oppression, which they know it's not true. That's what he told me. So I think that's why I've been able to go back. Yeah.
So you have talked to us about these different categories, right? Like dehumanized, infantilized, and recognized. And one of the questions from the audience is, do you think of your categories as a continuum? Like one is better than the other, like there is a medium, better, worst category to be in, or is...
Oh, I mean, yeah, we don't want to be dehumanized, right? This terrible, no, but just, so in terms of looking at it as a continuum, right? So there's all these variables, like I said, like overwork, day off, eat, food you eat, where you sleep, communication, access, right? Can we fit, does one household, and looking at all those variables, just fit one category, right? And so usually when they're dehumanized in every way possible, right? In every way possible. But if you are you could be recognized in some ways, like eat whatever you want, but you can be infantilized in terms of the day off. So in terms of the continuum, you do see a little bit more slippage between infantilization and because infantilization is often done, oh, I'm doing this for the well-being of this person. They don't have a day off because I don't want them to have sex and then get pregnant and then they'll get in trouble with their family in their country of origin. So it's well-intentioned. So there's a kind of slippage between infantilization and recognition.
Bueno, dado el tiempo que tenemos, voy a hacer la última pregunta en español. Y la pregunta es, ¿cómo puede la academia apoyar las estrategias de estas trabajadoras para alcanzar la justicia social?
Okay, how can they attain social justice? How can we as academics help to attain social justice? I think that a lot of us have partnered with nonprofit organizations, and I think it's important that we continue to do that. And that I think it's important that our research questions are not just driven by theory or by what other academics are concerned about, but we should ask questions that are driven, by, that drives people outside of academia that are addressing pressing social issues, right? So for example, in my work, I was made to look at aging because the Filipino Workers Center in Los Angeles wanted to know whether their constituents were able to retire. So we partnered to do a study on retirement, right? And so I think that's just one example. Or Human Rights Watch in the UAE couldn't access, they were having a hard time gaining access to domestic workers. So my collaborator, Rachel Sylvie, and I assisted Human Rights Watch and guided them through the field and took them to key sites where they could interview domestic workers, which they did for their 2014 report, on domestic work in the United Arab Emirates. But I do think that we have to be mindful of what are the concerns of those outside of academia.
And then I'll add a last question from Zara. Previous research I have done on paid domestic workers in Nigeria observed a similar spectrum of experiences of paid domestic workers, but this was shaped by factors such as age, ethnicity, living arrangements, types of work, and years of, I don't know that word, I'm sorry, but maybe years of work. So my question is in your research on migrant domestic workers, did the factors such as race also play a role in the diversity of labor conditions of paid domestic workers in UAE?
Yeah, so thank you for your question about race. And so race was something that I was troubled by in addressing. Also it was hard also to impose kind of these racial categories that we have, right? So for example, of slavery and domestic work in the United States being a continuum of slavery with African Americans first doing it, now mostly immigrant workers. So in the United Arab Emirates, let me just look at the United Arab Emirates. Singapore is a different question. Many Emiratis are black, right? So many Emiratis are black and many Emiratis are not black. And so then that complicated things. But because many Emiratis are black, according to Filipinos, that Ethiopians and Kenyans had greater alignment with the employers than with domestic workers. So there was a racial tension between Asians and Africans in the United Arab Emirates. That's a big question that I encountered, but I felt not equipped to address. That would have been a completely, a totally different book. And so, but for me, what it also signaled was how race is, obviously constituted socially and differently in different contexts. So race was very complicated there, and you saw this in parks where you would see groups of Asians, and I would assume they were all Filipino. Then I would get there, and it would be oh, there were Nepalese, Indonesians, and Filipinos hanging out, but they didn't speak to each other because they didn't speak each other's language. So some would just sit there silently, but the Filipinos would say, "Oh, they're newcomers and they don't have any friends, so we invited them." Then you see two Africans sitting over there. They're "Oh, no, we don't trust them." So there's definitely this racial divide. There was this pan-ethnic allegiance, but there was this huge racial divide. And a lot of them would, so there was affinity with the South Asians too, within Filipinos, but a lot of them would say within the workplace, they often felt this that employers favored African domestics over them. And I didn't really pursue that as a question. And someone should study it. Yeah.
So I thank you so much for being here with us today. We really appreciate your presence and the amazing work you shared with us. And everyone in the audience, also thank you for the first amazing day of the conference. Pay attention to our social media. We post snippets of quick access to what's happening through the day. And I hope you all have a good night, and we're going to see you tomorrow. Oh, Juliana.
Nada más un par de cosas prácticas. Bueno, además de agradecerles muchísimo a Racel, a Grazi, a Gabriela y las personas voluntarias que estuvieron apoyándonos. Mañana empezamos a las 8 en punto. Agradecemos un montón si pueden llegar antes, 7:30, para todo el tema de los receivers y tal, los receptores. Nos vamos a ver a la derecha, hay una calle. Esta calle les lleva directo al edificio de educación continua, Educom. Es el edificio donde vamos a estar trabajando para todas las sesiones que son paralelas. Está bien señalizado.